And we're very happy that you've joined us for today's presentation entitled In the Footsteps of Piero della Francesca. Our very special guest speaker on this star of the Italian Renaissance is once again our good friend, Elaine Ruffolo. Elaine has been teaching art history in Florence, Italy, and she's joining us once again from there today since 1990. She currently lectures for both Syracuse University and Stanford University in Florence. She's a great and engaging speaker, and I always enjoy learning from her. Elaine has led special study programs for many groups over the years, including student groups, corporate groups. She constantly is working with the Young Presidents Organization on excursions that they make. She's worked with museum groups, many others. And as most of you know, she's led 3 programs in Florence, Rome, and Venice over the past 10 years for the Muscarelle Museum's Board of Trustees. So I'm very happy to have Elaine joining us today. I know you'll enjoy her program. One note before we get started, we'll reserve some time at the end of Elaine's presentation for questions. So if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A section of Zoom or in the chat, and I'll get the questions to Elaine at the conclusion of her presentation. So Elaine, welcome, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone to the Muscarelle, my favorite group to come to do a presentation for. I feel like I'm with old friends. And hopefully we can all be in Italy together next year when international travel opens up again. So until then, it's my pleasure to come to you virtually from Florence, Italy, where it is now 8 o'clock in the evening. And together in this next hour, we will follow in the footsteps of Piero della Francesca. So make yourselves comfortable. Get up a little close to the screen. I have beautiful images to show you. And together we will rediscover, or for some of you, discover this important artist, to say the least. Now, the art of Piero della Francesca is one of the most fascinating of the Renaissance. And he is now acknowledged as one of the foundational artists of the 15th century. And perhaps more than any other early Renaissance painter, Piero is responsible for the development of Renaissance painting in Florence, but also throughout Italy. His compositions marry art and science with a cool precision and a sophisticated grasp of perspective. After all, he was a mathematician. Piero could also be identified as a wandering painter, in that he traveled continuously throughout his career, really beginning in very humble beginnings at the Tiber River Valley, where he was born, to great Italian courts of the 15th century. He worked, of course, in Florence, in Venice, in Rome, in Rimini. He worked for the Malatesta in Ferrara, the Este, of course, in Ferrara, Urbino, the Montefeltro, Perugia, Rome. Yet he always returned back to his home, which he always felt very connected to, the city of San Sepolcro. This is how I want you to think about Piero. His art represents a synthesis of Central Italian painting, which focuses on perspective, composition, and space. And he brings in a Northern, Netherlandish or Venetian, love of the quality of light and also natural phenomena, bringing together the quintessential artist of the 15th century. Piero today, of course, needs no introduction, yet surprisingly enough, he was only rediscovered in the mid-19th century and appealing only to specialists. Otherwise, he was lost to a bit of obscurity until, of course, we have discovered him today. Now, Before we get into Piero's life, and I'll follow his life chronologically and show you the highlights of his career, I just wanted to take a moment and just enjoy this wonderful painting. So come in close and have a look. This is called, of course, the Baptism of Christ. It was painted in the late 1430s for a monastery in San Sepolcro, and today it's in the National Gallery in London. Now, when I look at this painting, I feel a sense of peace. Piero evokes a calm, quiet sensibility in this remarkable painting that transcends the ages. Its simplicity, which gives it its strength, speaks to us today as it did 500 years ago. Okay, let's read the painting together. The story, of course, shows us the baptism of Christ, which is told in all 4 books of the Bible. John the Baptist, who is the cousin of Christ, is shown here baptizing Christ at the River Jordan. John is easy to recognize because he's wearing that lamb's wool in the desert to make him sweat and suffer as much as possible. The Holy Spirit is shown just above Christ's head in the form of a dove, and Christ stands in incredible humility at the edge of the River Jordan. On the left-hand side are angels, and then behind this group, you can see men who are getting ready or in their turn, waiting for baptism. This fellow is taking off his cloak. Then in the deep background, hard to see initially, but now that you're focused where my cursor is, you see a whole series of men who are wearing unusual costumes. They look as if they belong to a land far, far away, long, long ago, giving a touch of the exotic to this remarkable painting. Look at the figures. They are still. Piero gives the atmosphere a kind of quiet solemnity. The figure of John, let's read him. The figure of John is shown literally at the moment he's lifted up his arm and he's just pouring the drops of water on Christ's head. There is a kind of a tentative feel here. Look at that intense focus on the eyes of John. He's ever so gently turning the water onto Christ's head, and we feel like Christ's head is already wet the way his hair comes forward. The angels over on our left look a bit concerned, a little tentative as well. Now let's look at the composition. So he's giving this kind of human emotion, and the composition shows us Christ as the most important figure, shown in the center of the composition in contrapposto, in this weight shift, directly underneath the Holy Spirit, the dove. The dove is coming right out at us in perspective. Piero's places Christ's hands upwards in prayer, so we get this perfect vertical against the horizontal. Take a look at the verticals. Start on the left with me, with the angel, a tree, the columnar body of Christ, the standing figure of John, the legs of this figure in the background. And then he gives you 2 horizontals with the span of the wing of the dove, reaching, just coming together with that bit of a cloud. And then here, the center of Christ, just where he tucks in his waist, gets picked up by the waistband of John, move to the left, picked up by the waistbands and armband of these lovely angels. So what Piero's doing here is playing with verticals and horizontals, but he also adds in the implication of a circle, following with this big arch of the frame. Then your eye follows that landscape to this curved figure, to the curved figure of John, to the loincloth of Christ, back up to the arm and around again. And that's supported by that dip in the background of the landscape. Now, I don't think any of that's just arbitrary. This is a very carefully composed painting, which is about geometry. And Piero loves geometry. Piero has a deep belief that mathematics are the foundation of beauty. So I wanted to take a moment just to remind us why we are attracted to the work of Piero della Francesca. And this is an excellent example of that. Now, we know that Piero was born in 1416 in a small village called San Sepolcro, means the Holy Sepulchre, because in this little village, they had a relic of the Holy Sepulchre, which was brought back by two merchants who went to the Holy Land. That's where the name comes from. The area actually borders, just to give you a map, I know many of you know Italy well, and what we can see is San Sepolcro is right here in the center. It just is on the border of Tuscany, the Marche, or the Marches in English, and the area of Umbria, which is where you see where Perugia is, and down below that, this whole area. And it's an area that is very rough, very mountainous. Just thinking about that, March 6th, Michelangelo was born just north of San Sepolcro. See where it says Caprese. There must have been something really special about those hills that Piero della Francesca and Michelangelo were born, within a few miles of each other. We know that even though Piero traveled extensively, he would always go back to San Sepolcro whenever he could. Now, his real name was Piero di Benedetto di Pietro, but he's always known as Della Francesca. And his family had been in the business of tanning and selling leather, and they were quite well to do. We know that Piero was sent to school, and of course, he ended up studying mathematics, which of course he takes on in spades, and he ends up writing 3 treatises on mathematics. This is an image again of downtown San Sepolcro. I took this just 2 years ago. I take the students there every semester. It's a very quiet town. You get the feel of kind of a hominess, very charming, undiscovered by tourists still, and something that Piero, of course, loved. And he trained in this small village when he was probably about 10 years old with a rather feeble painter named Antonio di Giovanni di Anghiari. These Italian names always sound so grand. It just means Tony John's son from Anghiari. And he was a painter that was still stuck in the International Gothic style. But these are just 2 fresco fragments that show you works by Antonio di Giovanni. But I bring him up because this is where Piero would have received the rudiments of painting knowledge. He's got to know how to make frescoes. He's got to understand how to make brushes, how to grind up pigments, how to apply the pigments to wet plaster in just the right amount of time with just the right amount of humidity, etc., so that it stays well with true frescoes. And they did end up collaborating on a number of local churches and chapels. But truly, Piero's real teacher was nature. And the landscape in this area of San Sepolcro is dramatic. That's a good shot. You can see here the mountains, how very quickly the mountains rise up. Remember, if you think about Italy, right down the very center of Italy is a long spine of mountains called the Apennines. We would be on the west side, just about in the middle of the Italian peninsula. And you can see how those mountains rise up. And it must have inspired Piero della Francesca, standing here looking into the great distance and seeing how things get lighter and lighter as we move back into space. Here, this picture taken from underneath a chestnut tree, which is appropriate because the Casentino The region that Piero's in is famous for chestnuts. And I like this idea. I know it's romantic, but you can see the mists, the haze that come in on a cold morning in San Sepolcro. And again, something that I like to imagine Piero looking at, you know, in the same way that Leonardo da Vinci did, climbing up outside of Vinci, up into the hills, looking over, looking down and making the first landscape sketch in history, saying, this is the landscape. Today is August 8th, and I am very pleased. You know, there's this love of nature that both Piero and Leonardo da Vinci really have. So this is where of course, Piero gets his beginnings. But if you're a student of art, there's one city you have got to make your way to. And certainly in the 1430s, that was Florence. And here's Florence. This is where Piero della Francesca makes his way. Wow. By the opening of the 14th century, Florence was really enjoying an unprecedented period of wealth and prosperity. And by the opening of the 15th century, the time of Piero, where she's considered the great center of art and culture and a hotbed of competition. Now, Florence in 1440, let's say, is only a city of about 40,000 people, which means that everybody knows everyone. Therefore, when Piero della Francesca comes into Florence, I'm sure people would have remarked on it. He would have known where to look. And he is inspired by the city, which grows up on either side of the Arno River. Look at the graceful bridges that pull together the north and south side of the city. The city was filled with beautiful palaces and churches, medieval streets, wide open piazzas, handsome loggias. You know, think about it. This must have been incredible for this kid from San Sepolcro to enter into a city where the great literary figures such as Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio's memories were very much fixed in the minds of Florentines. Families such as the Medici, Frescobaldi, Antinori, great artists such as Donatello, Brunelleschi, Michelozzo, and Fra Angelico really would have made his mark on Piero, or the inspiration on Piero. Now here, this is the kind of thing that Piero would have seen walking through the streets of Florence. Here on your upper left-hand side, we can see the dome for Santa Maria del Fiore, just finished by Filippo Brunelleschi. They're just going around the clock here. And the center, I've got Luca della Robbia, beautiful roundels, which will be on the outside of the Hospital of the Innocents. Donatello would have just finished his St. George. And down below here, in this lower right-hand side, the first time we see perspective used in sculpture. See how the lines move your eye back to a vanishing point. And even atmospheric perspective in the light touching of this very, very thinly sculpted surface that could have inspired Piero. Leon Battista Alberti is there, Donatello, and of course, Masaccio. So these two artists, very different styles, but I think equally important to the formation of Piero. Down here in the lower right-hand side, this is by Fra Angelico. This is actually not in Florence. This is in Cortona, which is not very far at all from San Sepolcro. And you can see that there is a love of detail, a lightness, a sweetness about these figures that I can't help but see in the works by Piero. And at the same time, up here, you can see the very famous tribute money by Masaccio, where the characters look rough and ready. They look like, you know, guys from the Casentino. Masaccio came from very close to where Piero grew up, in fact, with these characters. Look at the chiaroscuro, the lights and darks that Masaccio uses, and Piero, of course, would have looked at like a wonderful lesson. He actually works physically with this artist whose name is Domenico Veneziano, and he was his assistant. He was working with him in 1439 at a place called Sant'Egidio, which doesn't exist any longer. But this was the high altar piece by Domenico Veneziano that Piero would have been involved with. And I think this is interesting because his name, Domenico Veneziano, tells us right away that he's Dominic from Venice. Therefore, as a Venetian painter, he's going to embrace a sense of light, a more painterly quality than the Florentines. And I think that must have inspired Piero. I also love the way Domenico Veneziano uses this strong diagonal light, which bounces around the figure of the Virgin Mary. Look at the chiaroscuro of her drapery, those lights and darks. This figure of John the Baptist looks out at us and gestures across to Christ. Christ looks back at John. This figure of Francis looks down at his book. Saint Zenobius holds up his hand. Saint Lucy holds her plate with her eyeballs. The gestures are poignant, weighty, clear, and the light that dances around this lovely altarpiece is again a kind of attempt at bringing together the Venetian sensibility of light with the Central Italian sensibility of composition. Now, the other thing to make sure we all realize is that at this point, the Medici are in power in Florence. Interestingly enough, Piero della Francesca never works for the Medici, but he would have been well aware of them when he goes into Florence. Under this man on your left, that's going to be Cosimo de' Medici. He's a great banker, of course, charging upwards towards 27% interest. He was undoubtedly the wealthiest individual in Europe at this point. And he's going to spend lavishly on the city of Florence. He also wants to make Florence even more at the center of art and culture with the Medici palace at the fulcrum. And that's what you're seeing here on the right-hand side is the Medici Palace. And I bring this up because there's an important event that takes place in Florence in 1439. It's called the Ecumenical Council. In a nutshell, it was an attempt for the Eastern and Western Church to come back together again. That is, Constantinople and Rome. The council was supposed to have met in Ferrara, but there was a plague that an outbreak of plague in Ferrara. So Cosimo said, the man on your left said, I'll have it. I'll throw the dinner party. And he invited the council to Florence, and they came in a contingency of 700 strong. Are going to, and Cosimo's bankrolling this. So we've got the Eastern and the Western Church. We've got John Paleologist. Who's John Paleologist? Well, here he is. He's going to be the Emperor of Constantinople at the time. And with him, 700 strong are coming into Florence with new ideas, translations of classical books, new kinds of cuisine and objects and costumes. And so when you look at something like this, which is Benozzo Gozzoli's, here we go, sorry about that. Right here, Echo. So if you take a look at something like this, which is done by Benozzo Gozzoli, you see that there's a real inspiration here on the East, especially when you start to look at some of these details of the costumes. And it's got a lot of pageantry and delightful images. And this is the kind of thing that must have just wowed Piero della Francesca when he was that young man being trained by the city of Florence. So he embraces Florence, he embraces these new ideas, he's there for these, the Ecumenical Council, and what does he do? He goes home. Because Piero always goes home. He loves San Sepolcro, it's his town, and he doesn't ever stay away very long. He returns back to San Sepolcro in 1445. And that's when he does his first professional work. And it's a very early work by Piero della Francesca. It was commissioned by, this is called the Polyptych of the Madonna Della Misericordia. What's a Misericordia? It's a confraternity who does good works. Which, by the way, Piero belonged to. The confraternity of the Misericordia in San Sepolcro, and Piero was a member of it. And inside the meeting room, there would have been an altar where you could have mass said for the confraternity. And each member was responsible for things such as burying the dead, caring for the sick, visiting people in jail, finding money for a dowry for a girl. It was set up to be pious and help out the downtrodden and your fellow people from San Sepolcro. And Piero took this on. It took him 17 years to finish because he would start it, leave, go back again. But because he was a member of the confraternity, he was able to more or less take his time. Now, the theme of this is called, again, the Madonna of Mercy. And it's painted in a rather old-fashioned style. So what we're going to do is look at this painting together and take a look at what is old-fashioned and predictable and belongs to an earlier period. And then we're going to take a look at the genius that's to come, which is Piero della Francesca. So what looks old-fashioned to me right away, so just back up and look at it. I'm sorry it doesn't have its frame any longer, but use your imaginations. It's rather fussy. There's lots of stuff going on. The hierarchy of the size of the figures is confusing. That is, you have this large group here. These saints on the right and saints on the left are too big. These figures up above, the Annunciation's too small, little figures here. That's quite old-fashioned. And then it says MIA on the lower right and the lower left, which stands for Misericordia. And then, of course, the gold background, which I can't imagine Piero was embracing. But again, we are in San Sepolcro, which is a backwater at this period. And perhaps the confraternity insisted that the gold background be used. It's getting close. Now, what is genius to come is this love of geometric shapes once again. You see the geometry that Piero gives us using the arch behind the Virgin Mary, bringing it together to the head of the Virgin Mary, which looks like a little egg, to her little eyes, to her bust, to this implied oval which comes out and towards us as she envelopes the members of the confraternity. Now, the iconography for this is not brand new. I'll give you an example. Here in Florence, for example, the Madonna della Misericordia from 1340 shows you a similar iconographical system, which means that the figures here are all looking up. These are members of every walk of Florentine life, looking up at the Madonna, and in her beautiful cape are roundels, which will show scenes of feeding the hungry, bringing water to the thirsty, burying the dead, etc., etc. So Piero takes that type of the Madonna della Misericordia, loses all that superfluous detail, and instead shows her with this beautiful grace and calmness, bringing these people underneath her. It's almost like she's opening up a canopy or opening up a tent of safety. And Piero loves the motif of tents. Keep that in mind. We'll see that later on. Then also, let's go down and look at these characters. And you can see that Piero's given us portraits. This man, for example, looks like somebody from San Sepolcro. This guy here with a funny hood on his head, he's going to be a member of the confraternity. People wanted to be anonymous. When they buried the dead or helped people out, they just wanted to do it for the love of God and not to be recognized for it. And that's why you see sometimes these hoods that are placed over the heads. It always looks a little bit ghostly. This guy right here with the distinctive Adam's apple, that's Piero della Francesca. We'll see him many times during this whole visit throughout his career. Then this figure, just to point out, we can start to see Piero della Francesca becoming interested in the nude, looking back to Masaccio, giving us contrapposto. I mean, he doesn't quite have it right when you really start to look at it. Doesn't quite understand how the body works with Saint Sebastian, but he's attempting it. I actually just have no words for those weird underpants. And here on the right-hand side, you can see John, where the drapery falls around him, revealing this body underneath. Quite different than the international Gothic style of Lorenzo Ghiberti. See, Lorenzo Ghiberti, this is in Florence, it's his Saint John the Baptist. His fall of the drapery falls in a sword blade line, like the curve of the edge of a sword. The figure itself is curved. That's called a Gothic sway. It kind of looks like a banana. Whereas Piero's understanding the movement of the figure, the fluttering of the drapery, bringing us now to a much more naturalistic figure. Or take a look at this. It's at the very top of the Misericordia and compare it to what Masaccio's doing. And we can see they both have contrapposto, the composition, it's all coming together, and Piero is now building piece by piece his professional style. And that's when we get to this. This is called the Resurrection, and it is a mature Piero della Francesca. Have a look for a moment. Wow. Everybody needs to see this once in their life. He painted this for the town hall of San Sepolcro, which today is the Civic Museum. So it's still in the same place where he painted it. And it's considered really one of the most famous paintings of the Renaissance. And the reason for that is partly because Aldous Huxley wrote a piece about this and called it the best picture ever painting. And it's kind of amazing because we came very close to losing it. San Sepolcro was occupied by the Germans at the end of World War II, and the British were ordered to completely destroy the city to get rid of the Germans. One of the British officers, his name was Tony Clark, remembered reading Huxley's description of the painting, and he defied orders to destroy the town. And subsequently, we still have Piero della Francesca's Resurrection in its original location. So thank you, Tony Clark, who made all the difference. The painting was given new life, and I guess appropriately, it really is the subject matter of new life. It's called the Resurrection, which is told in Matthew, and Christ himself prophesies that he would rise after 3 days after he was entombed. The reaction, of course, was that the Romans are going to place soldiers around the tomb to guard so that the Christians couldn't claim that he rose. That's the moment we're seeing now, that the soldiers have fallen asleep and Christ has just risen, resurrection. Let's start with the soldiers down below. I can tell they're Roman soldiers because I can see right on this shield, SP. It's the beginning of SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanum, telling me that they are Roman. Their wonderful armor is like something out of the imagination of Piero della Francesca. Look at their positions. One figure has his head in his hand. Another one has thrown his head backwards. This one rests on his lance. This one seems to be slipping forward as if he's going to pour out of the picture plane. What Piero's done here is he's tried to give you like the wedges of an orange, opening up each one and giving us as if they project into our space. It's quite successful. Even the colors are quite successful. And by the way, you should be able to recognize this soldier is indeed a portrait of Piero della Francesca. He used his own features in for these Roman soldiers. Then you see what he does. He paints the surface of this so that it looks a little bit like porphyry. And there's the sepulcher. The sepulcher is important to say the least because let's not forget that San Sepolcro is the Holy Sepulcher. Let me show you. This, for example, on your left is the high altar inside the Cathedral of San Sepolcro. Come up close. It's done by a 14th century painter. There's Christ with his foot on top of this sepulcher, and then beneath him are the Roman soldiers. So, Piero definitely would have had that, of course, in his mind. He makes it completely different, as you can see, by giving you the event unfolding before you. Let's take a look at the geometry, which is based again on verticals, starting with the tree on your left, the flag in Christ's hand, the body of Christ right in the center, this next tree, then a strong horizontal that runs across, a horizontal even behind Christ, and then this strong pyramid in the center. Geometry makes the composition solid and organized. It gives it weight. Take a look at the left side of the painting where you can see the trees are dried up. It seems like it's winter. Christ has risen, and then on the right, the trees burst into bloom. Even the body here of Christ is so interesting. He looks like he was down in the sepulcher. He almost looks as if he's, like a sleepwalker of some sort. With this dawn robe again, which reminds me of that St. Lucy altarpiece. And his expression reminiscent of an image of a Pantocrator, that bearded image of Christ. And the Roman soldiers, reminiscent of the position that Donatello places his Roman soldiers at the pulpits at San Lorenzo. These are bronze, they're a little hard to make out, but these are the sleeping soldiers. Here's Christ, he's got his foot on top of the sarcophagus. His shroud is all around him, almost as if it's in rags. And you see the correlation between the earlier artists and what Piero's able to do with the resurrection. Truly a remarkable work of art. Then Piero leaves his beloved town and he heads to Arezzo. And, perhaps his most famous and arguably the most important work by Piero della Francesca is found in Arezzo. And the city of Arezzo is perched high on a hill above the Arno River, just at the plain where those mountains I showed you come together, meet the foothills of the Val Chiani. It's a lovely hill town with Etruscan origins, and it's filled with Romanesque churches, medieval towers, lovely piazzas, kind of sleepy, a little bit Arezzo, beautiful, beautiful town. And in 1452, a wealthy merchant named Giovanni Bacci bought the rights to the high altar inside this church, which is called the Church of San Francesco. And the high altar is right here, of course. Unfortunately, the church has been damaged from earthquakes throughout the centuries, but here, the high altar still hangs this remarkable 13th century cross, which we're not going to do today. But the Bacci family bought the rights to the high altar, and he had hired a fresco painter, let's get a little closer, who does this vault up above. The fresco's painter's name was Bicci di Lorenzo. Again, old-fashioned. The earlier artist began the fresco cycle, but he died, and Piero takes it over. Commission goes to Piero, and he executed the frescoes that you see between 1452 and 1466. And the story is called The Legend of the True Cross. It comes from a specific book written by Jacopos Voragine at the end of the 13th century. It's like a fairy book, a fairy tale. And it's not the first time the legend of the True Cross has been depicted. This is one in Florence, I thought I would just show you quickly, by an artist named Taddeo Gaddi. It's a favorite theme, especially for the Franciscans, because it talks about the cross, right? And Saint Francis was so attached to the cross itself. Many, many paintings show him praying and crying at the bottom of the cross. And it's also kind of a perfect story. Here's the cycle now by Piero, because it unites this sort of a fascination with ancient times and exotic places, adventures, miraculous events. In short, the cycle, I'll tell you what the cycle is. The cycle explains the origins of the cross, where the wood comes from, the loss of the cross, the rediscovery of the cross, and the miracles associated with the cross. Truly an elaborate, epic journey for a piece of wood. In any case, I'm not going to go through every scene with you, or we'll be here till Christmas, but I do want to show you a few of what Piero comes up with. This one's called the Procession of the Queen of Sheba. And the Queen of Sheba meets King Solomon. And the story is fascinating. The Queen of Sheba's on a procession. She's on her way to meet Solomon. She falls to her knees, as you can see her on the left, on her knees in profile. And she has a revelation that the beam from the wood of the tree of life would one day be the cause of this, be the cross that the Savior would be crucified upon and would end the realm of the Jews. So here she is having her revelation. She's just dropped down. Then she comes in and she tells Solomon about what's going on. Okay, so that's the scene. Now let's take a look at the composition that Piero gives us. He divides it up clearly in two parts, with the left-hand side outside, very lush, beautiful trees, rather like the tree on the right-hand side of the resurrection, against this interior space, so that the background supports the foreground. And rather than putting these characters in dress from biblical times, Piero has put them in contemporary garb. So for example, inside the royal palace where Solomon is, let's go inside. I can see the architecture that is reminiscent of Leon Battista Alberti, very organized. It's classicizing, reviving classical antiquity. And these garments you can see all look as if they were, made in the 1460s. This wonderful hat. There's Mr. Bacci, the guy that paid for it. He's wearing a very expensive merchant's outfit. Oh, there's Piero della Francesca again. I see him with that kind of Adam's apple, and his face is clearly recognizable. And here on the left-hand side, you can see Piero's love of horses, this exterior space. He takes these two grooms and he uses a cartoon frontwards and then flips it. So you end up getting the mirror image of these two grooms. And the ladies here with their perfect little egg-shaped heads open up almost like a fan up towards you. It gives it a real sense of movement. Then here's a good detail. And then the dream of Constantine. So it's Constantine the Great. So Constantine the Great is going to have this battle. It's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And just before, he's trying to outdo Maxentius. And just before the battle, he's got to take a good night's sleep before the battle. And that's what Piero's showing us. And he has a dream. In the dream, an angel comes to him, shows him a cross, and will say, "In hoc signo vices," which means in this sign you shall be victorious. And that, according to Voragine's golden legend, is when Constantine converts to Christianity. Now, we're not even sure that was true, but in any case, that's what's being shown here. And it's really one of the most evocative scenes in the entire cycle. It depicts the Emperor Constantine sleeping in his great tent. See, that's the second time I've shown you one of these tents that Piero is fascinated with. He's awakened by he's dreaming of the angel who shows him the cross. And the protagonist of the painting, well, let's read it from bottom to top because it's worth getting in close. I can use my little zoom here to come in. And we can see the two soldiers, one with his back to us and one looking out at us. Harmony of opposites. This attendant seated here with his hand on his cheek, meaning I'm waiting. There's Constantine, who's inside his bed, all tucked in. This big pole in the center of the tent, holding up the fabric and the tent itself. And then we just start to see this fabulous, fabulous angel coming down in this very exaggerated foreshortening. The angel has his little pinky finger holding out, delicately holding the cross. Notice also how Piero gives you a series of peaks of other tents, which convinces us that we're in a huge encampment. Look at the light and how Piero has painted a blue, dark blue sky with stars. He's convincing us that it is a night scene. The star of this painting is the light. And here's the victory of Constantine. So the army, of course, he picks up the cross and he's going to take the cross with his army led by Constantine, who takes the cross in his hand and completely routs the enemy of Maxentius without even a fight. You've got this flags and crests and feathers and horns that make the scene look like some kind of a medieval tournament. A good way to think of it is a noble march on the left-hand side, which has the backdrop of lances and swords crossing the sky above the soldiers. Piero gives us splendid details of the armor, the flag, the funny animals you see. This is the emblem of Constantine the Great here with the eagle and this kind of strange, it almost looks like a dinosaur, but I think it's supposed to be some kind of a dragon, is the personal emblem of Maxentius. He uses this exotic scene, again, to give us the idea of a land far, far away, long, long ago. Let's get into some of these details. There's the cross, which he isolates against this blue background. Notice the glinting of the metal on this armor, the way the light bounces on the face of the figures. This guy blowing his horn hard so we can just see his cheeks puffing out. This thing just knocks me out. This treatment of the water. This is just in the middle. It's supposed to be the Tiber River, of course. And when you see that Piero takes great care in giving us these little ducks that are reflecting in the water. Look at this bush, which is reflected in this crystalline water. Here, the architecture as well. Or on this side, even more astonishing, in the deep background, you can see soldiers going inside this, what looks like a medieval castle. And again, they are all reflected in the water. That is just a knockout. And as are these details. Each face, each character treated in an individualistic way. The details such as this man who's biting his under lip, the white of the horse's eyes, Piero's self-portrait, this fabulous headdress that the figure, I feel like he's just turned his head quickly, the face of the patron, just a few more. Now, can you all see how the hats and the armor and the garments have an Eastern feel to it. Now you understand why I was emphasizing that Ecumenical Council in Florence, because clearly it's helped him out when he's painting in Arezzo. So what does Piero do next? He goes home. And on the way home, he stops at his mother's village, which is called Monterchi. Monterchi is tiny. You could really throw a stone across the village. And if you're driving through the Casentino, you just pull off of the main road, go up to the top of this hill, and you're in Monterchi. And you'll find one of the most marvelous, mysterious works by Piero called the Madonna Del Parto, which unfortunately is just a fragment of what it once was. It was originally inside a chapel called Santa Maria a Momentana in the middle of the village. Then there was a terrible earthquake. The painting was removed and placed in a chapel, which was in the middle of a cemetery. Then that cemetery, then it gets moved one more time. The painting gets taken away and placed inside, of all crazy things, a schoolhouse, which is now transformed into a museum. So it's an odd history to the painting. But Piero does this, perhaps remembering that it was for his mother's hometown. This idea of the Madonna del Parto, parto comes from the word partorire, which means to give birth. And you'll see very rarely in the history of art a pregnant Madonna. Here's an earlier one just to give you a reference point. But Piero gives us this one, which is, she's not shown with a girdle. See this tie around here, that's called a girdle. And then she's got the book in her hand. She has a ring on her finger, like she's the bride of Christ. Here's the patron down below. Right here, she's shown as a lovely, well, on one hand, she looks like a peasant girl, but she's wearing beautiful blue, like the Queen of Heaven. So it's really, there's something mysterious and marvelous about this. Okay, so let's break it down. It's the Madonna clearly in her 9th month, and she has an angel on the left, an angel on the right, who are opening up a tent once again. Now the tent maybe has symbolism behind it. It could be something like the Ark of the Covenant, the protection. It's, to me, a cloth of honor being opened up to present to us like a beautiful stage set, the Madonna in all of her splendor. The tent itself is interesting. I'll just give you a close-up. If you look here, this has been revealed. It's all beautifully designed with a pomegranate motif. Pomegranates are symbolic of fertility and abundance and resurrection. And the inside of the tent, can you see this here? This is all lined with fur pelts. So what we see is the tent, which is like a metaphor for heaven, for the Queen of Heaven. And the Virgin is shown in the center. She is like a vision for the spectator. It is a celebration of maternity. She turns in 3/4 views. We really get this, her girth. And if you notice, she puts her hands on her stomach. She's loosened up her dress to allow her stomach to get larger. She's in a protective gesture. That left hand on her hip, she just is almost at exhaustion. And then harmonizing like two beautiful bookends, we've got the angels. The angel on the left in green, harmonized to the angel on the right in red. The angel on the left with red wings, the angel on the right with green wings, the angel on the left with red socks, the angel on the right with green socks. You see, it's the same figure, but turned. Again, geometry, the light, this columnar figure. This is a beautiful work of art by Piero, and perhaps in honor of his mother. And then the last phase of Piero's life will be here at Urbino. Urbino's high up in the mountains of central Italy. I just love that Piero will go back and forth so much. He'll make his way to Venice, Rimini, then he goes to Florence, San Sepolcro, Arezzo, San Sepolcro, back to San Sepolcro, and then he goes to the great center of art and culture, Urbino. And it's an unlikely setting for one of the very leading centers of the Italian Renaissance. The city of Urbino was prosperous because it's situated near the northern border of the Papal States, and it was strategically important for the Pope. The money was brought, so the position was important. However, the money was brought in by this guy, whose name is Federico di Montefeltro. He's the Duke of Urbino. He was educated in the court of the Gonzaga. He was enormously successful as a military leader. He fought for Venice and Naples and Florence and the papacy. And by all accounts, he was prudent politically, he was a cunning fighter, he was a benevolent ruler. And what he wanted was a beautiful Renaissance palace and a Renaissance court. And he got it here in Urbino. And this is where Piero was invited to live. There's the courtyard of Urbino. It's a wonderful work of architecture, deserves an hour lecture just on the architecture, but we're talking about Piero. And that's where these famous portraits come in that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. This is what they look like today at the Uffizi, but at one time they were, this is a later frame. In Urbino, they would have been hinged so that you could open and close them like a book. The portraits of Federico da Montefeltro and his wife, Batista Sforza. So let's read. These are very important because these are the first portraits of the Renaissance. And that says a lot. I mean, there's portraits of people within bigger paintings, but these are portraits that were painted to look like these two individuals. A marriage portrait facing each other. They're early, I can tell that because they're in quite a strict profile. Later on, those portraits are going to turn slightly to a three-quarter view, to a full face view, and that's when we start to see, you know, things like the Mona Lisa. But this is the Federico di Montefeltro, who's making his money, of course. I can tell he's wealthy. He's wearing this expensive red. He's got on this ducal cap. But Piero della Francesca gives us almost too much detail on the figure of the Duke of Urbino, you know, warts and wrinkles and this very strange profile, but he lost his right eye and his right ear and the bridge of his nose in a joust. And Piero della Francesca does not hold back. He gives us this character with all of his deformities. And if you look, this, again, river scene here, moving back into one-point perspective, reminds us of the background at the image of Arezzo. Now here's his wife. Her name is Batista Sforza, and she was actually dead when the Duke of Urbino, when Piero painted this. She had a girl and 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 a boy, and died, dying in childbirth. In fact, she looks kind of dead, poor thing, doesn't she? But she's wearing high Renaissance jewelry, fashion in the Renaissance. Women would pluck their hairline all the way back to mid-scalp, believing the higher the forehead, the more beautiful they were considered, which is where we get our term highbrow. Blondes were considered more beautiful than brunettes. If you weren't a natural blonde, you dipped your hair in horse urine and sat in the sun to bleach it out. That's fashion in the Renaissance. And the painting is also painted on both sides, reminding us of a Roman emperor's coin. All right, so the last painting I'm going to show you, and before I turn it over to questions, is this flagellation of Christ, of course, which Piero does for the Duke of Urbino. And it's really proof that, you know, some things, really great things do come in incredibly small packages. This painting is about the size of a bread box. It's that tiny. And it's really been the mainstay of discussions of paintings in the 15th century. It's a very early example of the use of oil paint by Piero, which is interesting because oil paint will allow Piero to take his time and really give us detail. So the scene is, of course, flagellation, and that's what's going on the left-hand side of the painting in the background. Pontius Pilate is seated there, and Christ is being whipped under the orders of Pontius Pilate. He's tied to a column with an image of a Roman god at the top. Take a look at the architecture. Piero, with great precision, has given us, using one-point perspective, a completely believable space. Notice how the lines here of the pavement, let's just read it together, move our eye back through orthogonals right to the vanishing point, which is just behind Christ. Take a look also, here it's even signed by Piero, see Opus Piero from Sensepolcro. The figures here, there's a light that falls across Christ. But what seems so strange, of course, is why would this scene, if it's about the flagellation, be put in the deep background? And that's when art historians have tried to figure out what the meaning is behind this. Maybe these three, it could be kind of a manifesto of the early Renaissance. It could be these mysterious figures. Traditionally could be Ode Antonio with two of the Montefeltro rulers in the foreground. Perhaps they suggest the Gonzaga family who had just lost a son, and the image of the flagellation of Christ represents the pain of the loss of that son underneath the pain that Christ endures. Perhaps it is an allegory for the suffering of Constantinople after the fall to the Muslims in 1453. So we don't know what this thing means. It hasn't been defined yet, but this enigmatic nature of Piero della Francesca's flagellation underscores that regardless of the age of this thing, it continues to be something that we find fascinating and a puzzle for us. Now, Piero, I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time. Piero dies in the year 1492, which is, of course, the year that Columbus sails the ocean blue and a new world is opened up. And it's really through the art of Piero della Francesca that we can investigate what's going on in the courts in these major centers, as well as his hometown of Sensepolcro. As I said earlier, when I opened up this presentation, his art was not appreciated until the middle of the 19th century. And at that point, Piero's love of composition, organization, geometric forms, perspective, solemnity, hyperrealism, organization can be found in artists from his day, even to an extent, Botticelli, all the way to the contemporary period. And that is following in the footsteps of Piero della Francesca. So I hope you enjoyed that and learned something from it. I'll stop sharing now and be very, very happy to answer any questions if I can.
Well, Elaine, as always, just a fantastic presentation. Thanks so much for it. And we do have a couple of questions.
Good.
So let me just start with this one in the chat. Given Piero's frequent travels, did he have students? If yes, any names we might recognize?
Yeah, no, I mean, he definitely is going to have assistants, but he doesn't have any students that take over his workshop. He certainly will inspire later artists, but he doesn't have any direct students. At the end of his life, Piero was blind, so we don't think that he was able to teach any students at that point in any case. He was much more interested at the end of his life on mathematics and architecture. That would make you happy, David.
You know, it would. And I love the architecture in his paintings as well. And quite frankly, his sense of geometry and love of geometry, which comes through as you showed us.
It does.
Clear. So you talked about him being rediscovered in the 19th century, and of course, used as a model, it seemed, for many painters. Is there any particular moment that caused this rediscovery? Is someone all of a sudden bringing him back into the fore?
I think that's a very good question, whoever asked that. I think it might have corresponded to the period of the Grand Tour when people, even the trail of Piero della Francesca gets popular right about that time in the mid-19th century, where the Brits are coming over and they're exploring and they're going through Tuscany. They love Tuscany and they're finding almost like a treasure hunt as many Pieros as possible. And that's when it gets popular. There was a movie written, I think it was called Spring in April or something like that, where some British ladies go because they want to do the Madonna Del Parto before noon, showing that there's an attraction to it.
Interesting.
Or with Aldous Huxley too. I'm sure that writing of the most perfect painting had a lot to do with his popularity.
Elaine, what is it that's driving these painters of the Renaissance and beyond to the form of fresco versus painting on panel versus painting on canvas? Of course, you can only go so early on the painting on canvas, because surely they understand or begin to have a sense that this particular format is not so long lasting, or do they not have that sense yet?
Well, they don't have that sense yet because fresco paint is long lasting if it doesn't get damaged by earthquake or flood. And that's a rare thing to happen. The reason why they want to use fresco paint, which is another very good question, is it's very quick and it's very cheap. So you're able to get it going. It's pigment suspended in water on wet plaster. And when it dries in those about 5 hours in one day, it becomes part of the wall. Therefore, if you're in a hot, dry place like Tuscany, the thing will last forever. Think about the Sistine Chapel ceiling, not a problem. I mean, it's in perfect condition. And you're able to cover great spaces. That whole fresco of the Legend of the True Cross is enormous. There's no way you'd be able to do that in oil paint or in tempera paint, not a chance.
So it gives a really grand canvas to work.
Yeah.
What do you think? So I was struck by, to me, there really is a new moment in his paintings. There is a depth, a texture to it. And as you pointed out, many, many details that I think are sort of new to painting around his time.
Right.
What do you think? And I was really moved by a number of the paintings we saw and a number that I hadn't been familiar with before. What do you think his most important painting is? I'm sure it's one of the ones you showed us.
I think the baptism of Christ. I'm being completely subjective. I love that painting. I think it's got all the aspects, but in terms of importance, in terms of influence, the Legend of the True Cross, because it's so large and people could have seen it.
Right.
More so than the Resurrection, because San Sepolcro is again a backwater, but Arezzo was not such a backwater. It's a good question.
Well, Elaine, I think that wraps up our questions. It's a thrill to have you with us today. Of course, you'll be back with us in March on the 20th for our members lecture, where you're going to talk to us about Giotto and Padua and all the intersection there. We hope you have a wonderful—
David, do you mind if I invite people to my
Please.
Sunday? If anybody would like to join me on Sundays, I do presentations at, let's see, it would be 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in Virginia, and on different topics on Italian Renaissance art. Tomorrow I'm doing, in fact, a presentation on daily life in Renaissance Florence, which will be a lot of fun. And then on Tuesdays, I have guest lecturers come in as well. So come to elaineruffolo.com and you'll see the program, and you'll be very, very welcomed.
And I'll tell you as well, that's how I met Jane Zaloga, is through Elaine's lecture series. Just tuning in myself. I always enjoy seeing Elaine's lectures as well. And it really is a great series. We do get to have her exclusively from time to time.
Yes, yes, always.
That's also really great. So Elaine, have a great evening. Thanks to everybody for being with us today, and we'll see you at our next event.
All right. Ciao, everybody. Grazie. Ciao, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you.